It started like any other quiet morning drive. I was headed down Highway 29, taking the long way to DC like I always do when I need time to think. No motorcade. No security detail. Just me, my old Lincoln, and the soft hum of a gospel station playing low. That's when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. My tags were up to date, and I hadn't touched my phone. Still, the cruiser behind me signaled me to pull over to the side of the road. I sighed, eased the car to a stop, and turned off the ignition. The officer approached slowly, hand resting near his belt. He looked young, early 30s, maybe. His expression was tight, all business. He didn't recognize me. That much was clear right away. "License and registration," he said flatly, glancing into the car with that half-suspicious squint some officers get. I handed everything over without a word. I'd been through worse. Far worse. But something in his tone rubbed me the wrong way, not because it was aggressive, but because it was condescending. Like I didn't know the rules. Like I needed a lesson. "What brings you out this way?" he asked, flipping my license over. I gave him a small smile. "Just clearing my head." He nodded slowly, still studying my face. Then he said something that made my jaw clench. "You sure this is your car, ma'am?" I tilted my head. "Excuse me?" He didn't answer, just took a step back and called something into his radio. And that's when I realized, he didn't just stop me. He was digging for something. Something he thought he'd find because of how I looked. He had no idea who I was. And I had no intention of telling him, not yet. I watched him in the side mirror as he paced back to his cruiser, license and registration in hand, talking into the radio with more urgency than I expected for a routine traffic stop. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, 10 and 2, just like I always taught my clerks when we discussed real-world protocols during our seminars on civil liberties. Old habits die hard. He was taking his time. Too much time. Then he returned. "Ma'am," he said, more curt now, "step out of the vehicle." I turned slowly toward him. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His lips tightened. "Just following procedure." "I need you to step out of the car." I could see it in his eyes, he didn't think I belonged in this car or on this stretch of highway. He wasn't being violent, but he wasn't being respectful either. It was that particular kind of assumption some people make when they see a black woman with gray hair and quiet confidence, like you must have borrowed the dignity you're wearing. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, still silent. He glanced at my shoes, then at the judicial seal charm on my keychain. His eyes paused there for a moment, but moved on. "You from around here?" he asked. "No," I said. "But I know these roads." He folded his arms. "You know, it's unusual to see someone like you driving alone out here. Especially in a car like this. Someone like me." I didn't flinch. But my silence must have unsettled him, because he added, "We've had a few reports of suspicious vehicles lately. You fit a description." I raised an eyebrow. "And what description would that be?" He opened his mouth, then stopped himself. That pause told me everything. He didn't have a description. He just didn't like not being in control. "Stay right here," he said. "I'm going to run your plates again." I nodded once. "Take your time." Because what he didn't know was that the moment he punched in that license again, and someone at dispatch saw the name Justice Evelyn Rhodes, this little roadside stop was about to flip upside down. He disappeared back into his cruiser, clearly thinking he was handling some routine check on a vehicle he didn't think belonged to me. I stood there calmly, hands folded in front of me, the morning sun casting a warm glow on the shoulder of the highway. A few cars passed by, but no one slowed down. That was fine. I didn't need an audience. Inside the patrol car, I could see him speaking into the radio again. This time, his tone had changed, I could tell from the way his posture stiffened. He glanced up at me, then quickly looked away. Seconds later, he slammed the door and marched back, much faster than before. "Ma'am," he started, but his voice faltered. I just spoke with dispatch." I waited, saying nothing. His face was shifting, no longer stern or superior, but confused. Uneasy. "I wasn't aware of who you were." "Justice Rhodes," he said finally. "I didn't mean any disrespect." There it was. I gave a slight nod. "You were just doing your job, right?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for any misunderstanding." I stepped forward slowly, keeping my gaze steady on his. "Officer," I read his nameplate, Carson. "Tell me, how often do you pull over vehicles based on descriptions that don't exist?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That's not a rhetorical question," I added. "Because if you're stopping people just to see if they belong somewhere, then maybe we need to talk about what belonging means." His jaw tightened. "Again, I apologize, no need to apologize to me," I said, cutting him off gently. "But you may want to think about how this might have gone, if my name hadn't pulled weight." He nodded once, slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Do you?" He looked down at the ground. That was answer enough. There was a long silence between us. Only the hum of traffic and the soft chirp of cicadas filled the air. I could see it written all over Officer Carson's face, that uneasy cocktail of regret, confusion, and embarrassment. But what struck me most wasn't his discomfort. It was how routine this felt. He handed my license and registration back with both hands now, his posture suddenly respectful, careful, even. "I'll clear this stop from the system," he said. "It won't show up on any reports." I took the documents and slid them into my purse. "Thank you," I said. "But I don't mind if it's in the system. Let it stay there. Let there be a record." He looked up, caught off guard. "Ma'am. If we always erase the evidence of overreach," I continued, "we'll never fix the root of it. I'm not interested in embarrassment or headlines. I'm interested in accountability." He shifted uncomfortably. "Understood." I stepped back toward my car and paused at the door. "You know," I added, not turning around, "I started my career defending people who'd been stopped for no reason. Back then, I thought if I just rose high enough, got loud enough, changed enough laws, it would stop." I turned to look at him. But here I am, a sitting justice, being asked if I stole my own car. His face flushed. I let that hang in the air for a moment before opening the door. Then I added, "You may want to think long and hard about how many people you've stopped who didn't have a title to shield them." And with that, I slid into the car, started the engine, and drove off slowly. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, motionless, as if the weight of the stop had just finally hit him. The road ahead stretched wide and calm, but my mind wasn't. I kept my hands on the wheel, steady, eyes scanning the horizon. I should have felt triumphant, maybe even vindicated. But I didn't. What settled over me was a quiet kind of grief, the kind you feel when something familiar disappoints you once again. Because I wasn't angry that I'd been stopped. I was used to moments like that. They had followed me all the way up the courthouse steps and into chambers lined with mahogany and marble. No, what lingered was the thought of every woman who looked like me who wouldn't have had my name, my badge, or my title. What if I were someone else? What if I'd been nervous, said the wrong thing, moved too fast? Would Carson have been just as calm? Just as, by the book? That's what I couldn't stop thinking about. I pulled off at a gas station a few miles up the road. A young man held the door open for me with a smile and a "Morning, ma'am." Simple, human decency. No assumptions. No hesitation. I smiled back. "Morning." Inside, I grabbed a bottle of water and a black coffee. The woman behind the counter gave me a kind look. She didn't know who I was either. But unlike Carson, she didn't need to know to treat me with dignity. When I got back to the car, I sat for a long moment before pulling back onto the highway. This was more than a roadside stop. It was a reminder. A quiet warning that titles don't always protect you, and that change, real change, doesn't come from wearing robes or issuing rulings alone. It comes from waking people up, one moment at a time. Even if that moment happens on the side of a forgotten highway. The sun had risen higher now, casting golden streaks across the windshield as I drove toward DC. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. Some days, you just drive slow and carry the weight of the world with you. As I approached the city, I thought about the cases waiting on my desk, ones that would never make the evening news, but would shape lives just the same. Evictions. Sentencing guidelines. Civil suits that held the future of families in their balance. But this morning reminded me, no ruling I issue from the bench will matter if the system underneath it stays tilted, quiet and polite in some places, aggressive and sharp in others. Because fairness isn't just something we write into law. It has to be practiced in everyday choices, including those made on roadsides, in cruiser seats, and behind mirrored sunglasses. Back at the courthouse, my clerks were already gathering briefs and memos, eager to start the day. One of them, bright, young, sharp as they come, handed me a folder and asked, "All good this morning, Justice Rhodes?" I looked at her, at the future she represented. Then I smiled. Yes. And no. But I'm here. She gave a curious nod, not needing more. Because some stories, you don't tell in courtrooms. You live them. And sometimes, they remind you exactly why you sit in that chair in the first place. To make sure others don't have to. Later that week, Officer Carson filed a personal request through his department. He wanted to attend a public judicial lecture being hosted at Georgetown Law, one where Justice Evelyn Rhodes was scheduled to speak. He sat near the back, quiet, not in uniform. I saw him as I stepped to the podium. I didn't acknowledge him directly, but I adjusted my remarks. That night, I spoke not just about case law or constitutional interpretation, but about presence. About the small moments of power people hold when no one's watching. About how a badge or a robe can elevate, or expose, a person's principles. I said, true justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It begins in the silence before a decision, the moment you decide who someone is before they ever speak. I could feel the shift in the room. When the lecture ended, the officer stood slowly, as others applauded. He didn't approach me. He just nodded from a distance, his eyes different than before, not ashamed, but changed. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for. Not punishment. Not revenge. But awareness. And maybe, just maybe, the next woman driving alone, in a car that someone thinks she shouldn't own, won't be asked if she belongs. She just will. A few months passed. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived at my chambers, handwritten, plain envelope, no formal header. It was from Officer Carson. He wrote, "Justice Rhodes, I've thought about that morning every day. Not just what I did, but why I did it. I've reviewed every stop I've made since. I see patterns I never saw before. Your words stayed with me. Not just what you said, but how you said it. You could have embarrassed me. You could have made a call and ended my career. But you didn't. Instead, you taught me something I should have known all along, that respect shouldn't be earned through titles, but offered without condition. I've started leading internal bias training at our precinct. Voluntarily. It's small, but it's something. I thought you should know. I don't expect a response. I just wanted to say thank you, for stopping me that day, even though I thought I was the one stopping you." Carson I sat with the letter for a long time. There's no courtroom ruling for moments like this. No legal code for what it means when someone truly sees the error of their ways and chooses a new path. But I folded the letter, placed it in my top drawer, and whispered something I rarely allow myself to say aloud: maybe this is what justice really looks like. Not always loud. Not always swift. But real. Weeks later, I was invited to sit for a televised interview, part of a series on justice and public trust. I almost declined. I preferred courtrooms to cameras. But something told me this story wasn't quite finished. Halfway through the conversation, the host leaned forward and said, "Justice Rhodes, off record, there was a recent story circulating about a traffic stop involving you. Some say it's a rumor. Care to comment?" I took a quiet breath. "It wasn't a rumor," I replied. "It was a lesson, for both of us." The host blinked. "Do you mind sharing what happened?" I nodded. And I told the story, without bitterness, without embellishment. Just the facts. How an officer stopped me. How he didn't know who I was. How I let him speak, let him assume, let him act. Then I told the audience what really mattered. That officer's name was Carson, I said. And the most important part of the story is not what he did wrong, but what he did afterward. I explained the letter. The training initiative. The change in perspective. I didn't name him to shame him, I spoke of him to honor his growth. By the end, the host was quiet. "You turned a routine traffic stop," he said softly, "into something powerful." I shook my head gently. No. He did that, the moment he chose to reflect, rather than retreat. The interview went viral. Not because of drama. But because, for once, people saw something rare: accountability met with grace. Authority met with humility. And two strangers, on the side of a forgotten road, choosing humanity over ego. Months later, I was invited to deliver the commencement address at a prestigious law school. The auditorium was packed, future lawyers, professors, parents brimming with hope and ambition. I spoke about the law, yes. About justice. About precedent and perseverance. But near the end, I paused, and told the story again. The stop. The silence. The subtle assumptions. The shift. But this time, I framed it differently. Everyone wants to change the world, I told them. But sometimes the most powerful changes begin in the smallest, most uncomfortable places, like a gravel shoulder off Highway 29. I looked out into the sea of young faces. Your title will never define your integrity. And your authority will never excuse your assumptions. The crowd was silent. Then I added, and if you're ever in a position where you can choose between being right and being aware, choose awareness. That's where real justice begins. As I stepped down from the podium, I spotted a familiar face near the back. Officer Carson. He was there, not in uniform, not in shadow, but seated proudly beside a young woman in a graduation cap. His daughter. Our eyes met for a moment. He didn't speak. He just nodded. And I smiled. Because in that one silent exchange, we both understood something deeper than any law: justice isn't just about rulings. It's about redemption. And sometimes, the verdict is hope. Months after the law school speech, something unexpected began to happen. Local police departments reached out, inspired by the story of Officer Carson and Justice Rhodes. Several precincts started hosting joint workshops, judges, officers, community leaders, coming together to talk about trust, respect, and accountability. The story sparked conversations in places that rarely discussed them openly. At community centers, people shared their own experiences with law enforcement, many for the first time without fear or shame. A few officers stepped forward, admitting mistakes and pledging to change. One small town held a day of dialogue, where residents and officers walked the streets together, listening and learning from one another. It wasn't perfect. Change rarely is. But it was a start. And in a world too often divided by suspicion and silence, sometimes a single traffic stop, and the courage to face it honestly, was all it took to begin healing. Years later, I returned to that same stretch of Highway 29, not in my official capacity, but simply as Evelyn, a woman who once faced judgment on the roadside. The gravel shoulder looked the same, quiet and unassuming. Yet I felt the weight of what had changed, not just in me, but in the hearts and minds of others. Officer Carson's training programs had expanded statewide. Departments were more mindful. Communities and law enforcement began to rebuild trust brick by brick. I thought of the countless people who still face stops without justice or kindness, and how much work remained. But I also saw hope. Because the story of that day was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone willing to listen, to learn, and to change. As I looked down the road, I whispered quietly, "Justice is more than a title, it's a promise." And for that promise, I would keep fighting.